Okay, is this working? Awesome. Let's see if the video feed is coming through. Looks like it is. Okay. Welcome to episode 8 of my live stream. Those of you who still tune in, I am sorry, and thank you for joining. So today we're going to look at the features and enhancements in Caddy 2.5. This is a pretty big release. I don't think we have done a release this big since Caddy 2 was released in terms of like number of changes and enhancements and stuff. And it's been in the works for probably 6 months, and it's been 3 or 4 months, at least probably 3 or 4 months since our last patch release even. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, and this is just in our first beta. We're probably going to have either another beta or a release candidate coming up in a week or two, depending on how much can get done and how many bugs are reported. So please use Caddy 2.5 Beta 1. If you scroll down here past the changelog, which is quite extensive, you can download the artifacts for your platform. So Caddy is 7 years old, and we now have we're closing in on 40,000 stars soon. So that's exciting. Thank you to everyone who uses Caddy and to those who sponsor. That is why we're able to keep working on it. So, yeah, let's just dive right in. So we have a few kind of highlights in this release, and I'll take you through each of these a little bit. I'll touch on all of these here. So let's look at the dynamic Upstreams feature. So this is pretty cool because this means that when you configure the reverse proxy, you no longer need to hard code the Upstreams or the backends that you can use with it. So Caddy now has the ability to get the list of Upstreams or backend servers at every request, and this way you don't have to keep reloading your config if you take down Upstreams or you or take down backends or you put new ones up. You can have something else that tells Caddy what's currently available at runtime. And this is very modular, so this can be extended. This is a really nice feature, and this is actually a sponsored feature from a company you've heard of that I can't name quite yet or announce anything quite yet, but hoping to get around to that soon. So I appreciate that sponsorship. So basically, how this works is, so we closed a lot of issues with this, or at least touched on quite a few issues with this feature. And so the way it works is here in your JSON, instead of configuring static Upstreams and listing the IP addresses or whatever for all your Upstreams, you configure dynamic Upstreams and you specify a module. In this case, so this change, we actually ship 2 modules for dynamic Upstreams. One is SRV lookups and the other one is A record lookups. These are both DNS-based modules, and so that's just a pretty simple and common way to dynamically keep track of what backends are available. And so Caddy will, at every request, or in this case, in these particular modules have some caching going on, but you could potentially at every request look up which backends are available. So you just specify the SRV source and then you give the service name that you want to look up. Or if you are using A records and you have, let's say, A records that you set for all your backends, then you can do that, and then of course you have to specify the port because A records do not put a port in there. And we do cache results for about a minute, so DNS lookups only performed every minute. You can configure that, and so this SRV backend is really nice if you're using something like Console or anything else that manages SRV records. You just point this to that, and voila, Caddy will be getting the backends dynamically. Now, this has a few implications. Oh, and by the way, you can use this in the Caddy file as well. Let me show you that. If we go over to the documentation, which is already live for the Caddy file anyway, and we go to the reverse proxy directive, we've reorganized it a little bit, and we see Upstreams. So you know, this is the syntax, reverse proxy, and then you can either list each of the upstreams, or you can say dynamic in a subdirective here. And this basically, dynamic upstreams below. So this comes standard with 2 dynamic upstream modules. One is SRV, and so you can specify all the properties for doing SRV record lookups. Or if you're using A records, it's very similar. And I'll show you in the code, it's actually very similar. Upstreams. I actually implemented the SRV upstreams one, and then I copied and pasted it and made it A records, and it's like exactly the same thing. So we do some parsing when we provision the SRV upstream, and then this method here is what Caddy calls get upstreams during every request. It passes in the request, so we return a list of upstreams. Pretty easy. You can see that we check the cache first to see if we're good to go with the cache. If we need to refresh the cache or we don't have anything, then we simply, let's say, do some replacements. So if you want to use like environment variables or anything on the request. And then we just call lookup SRV, and it does most of the work for us. So then we just need to join these, make an upstream, and update the cache, and then return it. Pretty easy. And we do basically the same thing for, we create this SRV lookup struct to combine the list of upstreams with the time that we got the list of upstreams. So pretty straightforward. We do the same thing for A records, A upstreams, and again, this also works with quadruple A records if you're using IP version 6. Get upstreams, and it literally is like the same code, except we call lookup IP addr instead of lookup SRV. So pretty straightforward. Really nothing special there. Let me show you though in the reverse proxy. You actually, I think this was in a previous live stream where I implemented this feature. This is a big file. What are we at now? 1,300 lines. Serve HTTP. Oh, let's see here. Serve HTTP. Yeah, so the reverse proxy, we refactored it a little bit, and we basically have what's called a proxy loop. The proxy loop is every iteration is an attempt to proxy the request to a backend. So we retry every request a number of times, and this is how we handle load balancing and retries. Like if there's backends that are unhealthy or whatever, we can handle that. We can compensate by retrying. And so we have a proxy loop iteration. We pass in a ton of state. It was a little unfortunate, but it's better in its own function, especially for defers that we use here. So the first thing we actually do is we get the list of upstreams. So we start with the hard-coded list of upstreams. So you can see that we still have our upstream pool, that the reverse proxy that you are currently using, where you just hard-code the list of backends. But then we added this dynamic upstreams field, where during provisioning we parse that into an upstream source, which is simply any type that implements get upstreams. So, so here back in our proxy loop, we start with the static list of upstreams, but if an upstream source is defined, then we call its getUpstreams method. We get the list of upstreams, and if it fails, we do use the static upstream. So you can use those as kind of a fallback if your dynamic upstream module is unreliable. But otherwise, we provision each upstream, and that is important for setting in some like dial information, like the circuit breaker, and even setting up health checks. We do support passive health checks with dynamic upstreams. Oops. There's some funny implications here though, because dynamic upstreams only live for, here we are. Okay, back to where we were. They only live for the duration of not even the whole request, but only that particular proxy loop iteration. And so, as you know, there's passive health checks and there's active health checks. And what we decided in a previous live stream when I was implementing this is that active health checks just don't make any sense with dynamic upstreams. Active health checks are those which run on a timer in the background, and they query the upstreams. The problem is that they happen out of the flow of a request, and so there's no way to get the list of upstreams dynamically in an active health check scenario. And then you shouldn't really need that anyway, because your get upstreams method shouldn't be returning unhealthy backends in the first place. We do support passive health checking, but again, not super useful because you should only be returning available backends anyway. But passive health checks, which basically count failures during the flow of a request, and then if it reaches if it goes out of tolerance, then you consider it down. We do technically support that, but it only works well if your upstreams are stable, in the sense of like the list of backends that you get from get upstreams doesn't change very much. If it's the worst case scenario is you have a different backend for every request or every proxy loop iteration, and that's just not going to work very well with passive health checks. Or load balancing. So load balancing is also affected. The only load balancer that actually has state between requests is the round robin one, and round robin policy. So that one, in the case of get upstreams returning variable lists of backends every time, the only side effect that you're going to see with round robin is that it's going to appear more random than actually round robining. But other load balancing policies should work fine. Anyway, so we provision the upstreams, and then when we're done, we do need to clean up the upstreams. So that's all there is to the dynamic part of the upstreams. But what's really cool about this is that if a backend comes, let's say that a request comes in, Caddy tries proxying it, the request fails, and then there's a short delay between the next loop iteration. If a backend comes up during that time, it will be picked up by this function because get upstreams is called on every loop iteration as opposed to just at the beginning of the request. So this is cool because you can actually take all your backends down. Caddy will hold on to all the requests and wait for one backend to become available. And then the next time Caddy tries with those requests, it will just work. It will just proxy through. So that's actually a really cool feature that people have already started using. So anyway, that's what the dynamic upstreams feature is like. I think this is a really neat feature. We are deprecating the lookup SRV field, or if you're using SRV plus in your Caddy file, we're not going to support that anymore, so replace that with the dynamic upstreams module. Cool. Well, I appreciate all one of you who are watching. Thanks, Francis, for joining right now. Okay, the next really cool feature that Caddy 2.5 has is that it will automatically get certificates from Tailscale. So if you don't know what Tailscale is, that's okay, but you should learn what it is. It's basically a VPN. It's based on WireGuard, but it's zero config, and it is kind of magical how it works. I started using it. I think it's great. And I think it's really good technology. So if you want to run a network across devices that is private and encrypted and secure, then I do recommend Tailscale. And Tailscale and Caddy have similar ideologies. We both want to just work. And so Tailscale reached out, and I thought this was a great idea that, hey, Caddy should just use Tailscale certificates because you can enable HTTPS. Do they have you can enable HTTPS on your Tailscale instance, and you can actually get like certificates from Let's Encrypt for a domain name at .ts.net. And then of course you can access services over this domain name within your VPN. And if you want to use, but now you can use Caddy to like reverse proxy those services in your VPN. And the cool thing is that in Caddy there's no config necessary. So let me show you how this works. to make this work, you just configure your Caddy file. So if I'm writing a Caddy file, you start with your site address. So in this case, it would be like your machine name dot your Tailscale alias. This is like your anonymous. Let me show you. Like monitoring dot and then yak bebop would be like your alias, and Tailscale can assign you one, or it's just a random word basically. .ts.net, and then the rest of your config really. So and that's all you need for your Caddy file. Like you literally don't have to tell Caddy to get it from Tailscale. Now you do need to configure. You do need to make sure Caddy has access to the Tailscale socket or the Tailscale process. So to do this, it's actually really easy. So there's a etc default Tailscale D config file, and within it you want to add a line like this: ts permit cert uid, and then in the latest version of Tailscale you can actually list the username directly. You don't need the user ID number. And so if you add that, and then let's see, where am I at? And then you need to restart Tailscale. Now that's all you need to do. There was an issue recently where someone wasn't able to get Tailscale's certificates via Caddy until we fixed it here. And the reason is that using Tailscale down and Tailscale up is not sufficient. That was the assumption here. And what you actually need to do is run system control restart Tailscale D, and boom. And then Caddy will have access to the Tailscale certificates. So you don't need to configure Caddy at all. You just need to add this line to your Tailscale D config, and then make sure you restart Tailscale and don't just take it down and put it up again. You have to use systemd. So that's pretty cool, and then it actually just works. The other cool thing is that you don't even need to specify the name in the Caddy file. You could do something like this, and it will still work. So I think that's really cool. So thank you to Tailscale for sponsoring that work as well. I think that's a great feature, a great integration. Makes HTTPS a lot more accessible. Okay, so next up we've got tracing. So yeah, we have OpenTelemetry support now. So if you're into that, I don't actually know much about this, but we have a new tracing directive, and you specify the span name in your Caddy file under the tracing directive, and you can configure it through environment variables. This is not my favorite, to be honest, and I think this is room for improvement, where we do want to move all the configuration into the config file. But I don't know, actually, I'm not very familiar with this space. Maybe configuring OpenTelemetry through environment variables is the norm, in which case we want to comply with conventions. So I don't know, it would be nice if there was at least a way to do it from the config file, but anyway, here's a simple Caddy file example. So if you want to trace things, requests, under the myhandler path, actually this particular example is only the myhandler path because there's no star here at the suffix, but you just say tracing, and then you specify the span name, and voila, OpenTelemetry tracing. So I think that's a great contribution. Oops. Reverse proxy. Ah, yes. So have you ever wanted to intercept the response on a reverse proxy handler? Well, you can now, thanks to Francis' contribution. We have this nifty copy response and copy response headers directives that can be used in a special place in the Caddy file. So let me show you that. So if you go to the reverse proxy directive and you want to intercept responses, you can specify the handle response subdirective. So if you look up here in the syntax, the reverse proxy has a subdirective called handle response. And inside here, you can use kind of any directives, really. This is just a normal HTTP route, but you can also use copy response and copy response headers. So yeah, so this is useful if you want to copy the response from the back end of the client, and you can change the status code while you're doing that. Or if you just want to copy the response headers, you can do that as well, where it just takes the headers and puts them down to the client. So yeah, that's pretty useful if you want to be able to modify anything about the response or inspect it. You can do that before you write it out to the client. So I think it's a very powerful feature. Yeah, here's an example of handle response that does kind of like Excel redirect, or if you want like custom error pages. Oh yeah, here's some examples of dynamic upstreams. Very easy. Yeah, I think those are really cool features. So okay, we have 2 new API endpoints. I think this is also useful if you are administering a system or setting up a machine. We have PKI CA and then the ID of the CA, and then you can also do /certificates. And this will give you information about Caddy's certificate authority. So as you know, Caddy ships with kind of built-in PKI facilities. Basically, they are features that can, or they're facilities that can sign certificates and issue certificates. So they are root and intermediate certificates that Caddy automatically manages for you, including installing the trust for those certificates on the local machine. But it's really useful to be able to get those certificates, especially programmatically, so that you can provision trust on other machines or whatever. And so let me show you this. So I have a Caddy instance running, and running the beta, and if I just do PKI/CA/local, local is the default CA name or ID, and this is what Caddy will use to sign certificates for internal host names or local hosts or IP addresses like 127.0.0.1. You'll get a self-signed certificate through the CA. But it should be trusted because Caddy will try and install the trust for you automatically. It doesn't always work, but most of the time it does. And voila, we have a JSON response. I don't have JQ installed. Hang on. This would be useful. There we go. That's a little easier to read. So you can see its ID, Caddy local authority, the root. You can see its intermediate certificate and its common names. So again, this is really useful if you're automating this PKI stuff. And then if you just want the certificates, you can actually get the certificate chain just by going to /certificates, and voila, you have the PEM chain. So this is the root and intermediate certificate for Caddy's local CA. And this will be a little different for everyone, obviously. So yeah, that's documented on our website. Scroll way up. API. Yeah. Oh, yeah, these links don't work. I need to fix that. Ta-da. Oh yeah, we need to update this. This is actually an API endpoint. We've had this already in Caddy before. It tells you about the upstreams, like the static ones. Doesn't work super well now that we've refactored health checks, and this doesn't work with dynamic upstreams, so we'll need to look at that hopefully before a stable release. So those are the main new features of Caddy 2.5. I think they're really awesome. We have a ton of notable features though too. I want to just walk through here. Maybe we'll look at a few in depth, but the reverse proxy, yes, we already set X forwarded for and X forwarded proto, but now we also set X forwarded host. We also have implemented kind of a security improvement where the X-forwarded headers they're not trusted automatically because you can obviously just spoof them. You can set them as an arbitrary client. So if you want to trust them, you can specify trusted proxies. And so, for example, if you're behind Cloudflare and you want to trust Cloudflare, then you can use Cloudflare's IP ranges in trusted proxies and benefit from those headers. And so help protect your application. Someone tweeted about this recently, how they were able to remove a huge warning chunk from their project's documentation, and now they can just say use Caddy because it'll take care of this trust for you. Another huge improvement is actually in how we handle revoked certificates. Caddy 2.4 would automatically attempt to replace revoked certificates. However, it was more of a party trick than a robust we guarantee this should work in pretty much every scenario. One situation it didn't work in was on-demand TLS. And after another mass revocation event, I decided to go ahead and spend a few days actually making certificate replacement very robust and reliable. And I think we have the best in the industry now for automatically replacing revoked certificates. It was a little tricky, but we did test it in production through revocation events, and it does now after a couple more. Here's a follow-up commit. You can see there were quite a few changes in just this commit alone. We now know that it works pretty reliably, and we also improved logging. So if your certificate is revoked, it will automatically be replaced. I'm pretty confident in that. So you don't have to worry about that. And that should work for pretty much all configurations. Another cool feature is that with automatic HTTPS is that Caddy can now get certificates from what are called managers. So by default, Caddy will get certificates from issuers, which are like Acme, or basically any module where you can give it a certificate signing request, a CSR, and it returns a certificate to you. And that's great. The issuers are great, where Caddy is managing the certificate and automatically doing the renewal. Actually, I want to go to the documentation here. Go doc. I want to show you this. So an issuer, again, is you pass in a certificate signing request and you get an issued certificate. So this is used when Caddy is managing the certificate. Caddy is the one doing the renewals, etc. But what if you have an external service that is managing the certificate for you, and all you want to do is just use that certificate? Just get it, literally just get the certificate and present it. We don't manage it, we don't store it necessarily, we literally just get it and use it. And that is what a manager is for. Wow, I can't type. Acme Manager, well, the naming is unfortunate. I might need to update this because the Acme Manager is actually the old type that it's an issuer, so I should probably rename that to Acme Issuer. I didn't anticipate managers at the time. But now we have Certificate Manager, where all you can do is call get certificate, and instead of a certificate signing request, we're not asking for a new certificate, we're asking for an existing one. So we just pass in the client hello info, and we get back a TLS certificate. And so this is actually what we use for the Tailscale support, because Tailscale is managing the certificate, we're just using it. So this works very nicely. It's a very useful feature, and this is of course extensible. So if you have other services that are managing certificates, Caddy can be extended to support that, no problem. Also, if you are doing the DNS challenge, you can delegate the solving of that challenge to another domain in Caddy without having to use CNAMEs. I don't remember exactly how this works. A domain override. Yeah, DNS plugins don't need to support this themselves. Oh, and they do need a CNAME record, but DNS plugins don't need to support it, so that can be useful. I haven't used this feature, but I know a lot of people have found it useful. I'm going to skip a few things here for time, but you can take a look at this. Timeout adjustments. Oh, significant improvements to logging. So especially if you are privacy oriented, we actually now empty sensitive HTTP headers in access logs. So like cookie authorization and proxy authorization, those are now emptied by default. You can opt in to log those, but probably only for troubleshooting or debugging purposes. And in addition, if you want to filter sensitive values in logs, you can now filter query string parameters, cookie values, and by using regular expressions, or you can also hash log values. So this is great for, again, sensitive information in the logs. We removed common log format. Amazingly, I haven't heard any complaints yet. I'm sure we will hear some, but I'm so done with common log format. It is just not very useful. Upgrade your tooling. If that's all you can support, I'd say it's time to upgrade your tooling. Structured logs are just so much more useful, way more efficient, and way less troublesome and cumbersome. And keeping this supported in Caddy has become quite tedious. If you still need common log format, you can use a separate plugin. It's called the transform encoder, and it's a log encoder that you can specify a particular template, basically. And so if you want Apache common log, we have a shortcut actually in this plugin for common log that expands out to this particular template or this configuration. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward if you still need that. I just don't recommend. Common log is awful in so many ways. We changed logging a little bit, enhanced the varsmatcher. Not many people are probably using that. Varsmatcher is useful if you're using like a map directive and you're kind of having a bit more of a programmatic or like a much more variable oriented config flow. You can use maps and variables to kind of adjust the flow of requests in your config, in your HTTP routes. We now can assign requests UUIDs. If you want to redirect HTTP requests on the TLS port or on the HTTPS port, so if you make, let me rephrase this, Francis implemented this, if you make an HTTP request to an HTTPS port, Caddy used to just respond with the Go standard library's default message of, we received an HTTP request on the HTTPS port. Well, now we actually issue a redirect optionally if you add this plugin, this listener wrapper plugin. Well, it's included in Caddy. You just have to enable it in your config, and then Caddy will issue a redirect instead. So it's not default, but it's available if you want that. Yeah, you can manage PKI app with the Caddy file, you can set a default bind address, and you can use the method directive to change the request method, because that's kind of useful. We also, again, more refactoring on handle response, changed it to replace status. And if you're using dynamic config loading, in other words, config loading that like you give Caddy an initial config and then it loads the real config, and it can do this on an interval. We renamed the interval property from load interval to load delay, because actually when you load a config, it doesn't do it on an interval, it only delays, it only like sleeps basically for a certain amount of time and then loads the new config. And if you want to make config loading happen on a regular interval, you set, it's still load delay, but you just make sure that the config that is loaded also has load delay set, as opposed to load interval, which gives you the false impression that just the first config needs to set this. So that's not true. If you then want to stop the config loading, then you load a config that doesn't have load delay or dynamic config loading configured. So pretty straightforward. It's just one config at a time. That's pretty much it for the major changes. We did fix a security vulnerability related to metrics cardinality, so thanks to David for that report. You can see the full changelog here on GitHub. It's, again, quite extensive. Thank you to everyone who contributed. This is really the best release yet. We made good progress on catching up on pull requests and issues. I always try and keep this number low for, the thousands that have been closed. Staying under 100 or under 10 or 20 pull requests is really amazing. So thanks to everyone who contributes. You see we have a couple bugs that we probably should fix here soon, maybe even during the beta period. So hit me up on Twitter or the forums or something if you have a question, or if you have a bug report. We'd love to hear about it in the issues. So thank you to everyone who uses Caddy, and I hope you enjoy this release.